Let me start with a sound you probably won't associate with reform in the Indian educational system.
Is that a tennis ball?
Close. Pickleball. It's the fastest growing sport in the world and apparently a new symbol of how private equity is reshaping some of India's most prestigious schools.
Because in one of the stories that we're talking about today, investors backed shiny new sports courts while teachers' training budgets were shrinking, which meant that salaries began stagnating, teachers started leaving, and student numbers began dipping. And we are talking about elite international schools here.
This was our colleague, the Ken reporter Valli Vikram's story. She looked inside private equity backed school acquisitions where Western style cost cutting and standardization has ended up colliding with India's founder led school culture.
But, and this is important, this is not one of your good versus bad stories where private equity is the villain. Some investors have actually managed to adapt. Long term players have preserved culture, they have improved governance, and made the model work. So the question isn't, is private equity bad for schools? It is more complicated than that.
And then there's Mutasim's story.
He zooms out and kind of changes the perspective. He looked at one of India's first private equity backed education infrastructure platforms that is prepping to go public. And its filings reveal something quite striking. One school is paying 65% of its revenue and 83% of its surplus as rent. And here's the twist, the landlord and the tenant are owned by the same private equity firm.
The story goes beyond what's going on in the campus and gets into financial engineering, how non-profit schools can be restructured and turned into a high yield asset.
So the question is, are these investments bringing professional governments and much needed capital to a struggling sector?
Or are they quietly changing what a school is, from a community institution into a financial asset?
So today in the studio, we have Mutasim and Valli who followed the money, visited the campuses, and talked to the teachers and founders who are caught in this shift.
Because somewhere between the pickleball court and the prospectus,
Is the real story about who schools are ultimately for.
welcome to Daybreak.
I'm your host, Snigdha,
And I'm Rachel.
and every day we bring you one business story that is worth understanding and worth your time.
Today is Friday, the 27th of February. So, my first question is to Valli. Valli, your story opens with this 11th grader at Glendale High who's been teaching herself economics through YouTube. Now, how did you find this person and what was going through your head when you heard what her experience was like?
So how I found this person is actually because I was I was at this point where I was attending a lot of education conferences just to understand more about this whole PE landscape and everything that was coming. And at one of these conferences, I remember it happened in Hyderabad, there were a group of parents, I think from Glendale and Sancta Maria, if I remember correctly, both schools in Hyderabad. And they were talking about how they were really unhappy with the way that these schools were being run and how their kids were not happy. And that's about the gist that they gave. So then I asked one of them if I could talk to one of their kids, and then I got in touch with this girl. And she was telling me how, for the entirety of 11th grade, and if you don't know, like, especially when you're doing something like GCSEs in Cambridge, 11th grade is like the most important year. So it's really the year where you have to be on it and where you need a good teacher. So for this girl to not have a good teacher, especially in a year where it was incredibly important and she's applying to colleges abroad, was honestly unbelievable for me. It's different if she was like, okay, maybe like even if you're in year 12, you're done applying to colleges. But in year 11, to not have a good teacher, I think I just felt really bad for her. So that's how I found her, and I really thought that it was a very sad state of affairs, especially when this girl was also talking to me about how she wanted to build her profile, and she wasn't getting the necessary support from her school in order to do that. Like she would go up to, I think, her career guidance counselor and try to ask her like how to go about doing this, and the guidance counselor would just be like, I don't have enough time to accurately, like, build a profile for each and every student. So even beyond the classroom, I think I just felt bad about how this girl was going about her experiences. It felt like she was really alone and she was doing everything by herself.
Mutasim, you approach this story from like the other side, right? Uh, so can you tell us how did we even get here? Because schools were always meant to be not for profit, right? Because of the right to education. How exactly did PE start entering the picture? Like, why would a profit-seeking fund invest in something like education?
Thank you, Snigdha and Rachel. So basically, if you're looking at this from an investor standpoint, any investment is a risk return optimization game, right? So if you look at schools and specifically private schools, which I'll come to later, and you talk about risk, you see that schools just by design are going to have a very, very stable cash flow, right? Even come COVID, you saw that schools did not really get hit that much in the sense that education is sort of a very essential thing that especially parents in India want their students to have, especially because a lot of your employment outcomes are also determined from which kind of school you went to, what kind of exposure you got, right? So, in that sense, the private equity fund sees that there is very little risk in investing into schools, which the DRHP of Elevate that I covered specifically called schools a recession resistant asset class. Similarly, with hospitals, again, an essential service that you have to avail.
Because children will always go to school and people will
Exactly.
always fall sick,
Exactly.
right?
You as a parent might, compromise on buying like a cheaper phone or staying at a cheaper house, but you would want to invest in a
Yeah.
good school for your for your child's education. So that is one. That is how they see that the risk is like not present. Second, in terms of return, now if we were not in this not for profit regulation space, then returns would have been fairly easy. You just have a revenue share with the fee that the school gets, but that is not, you cannot do that in India. And this is sort of
Can you please explain that a little bit more?
sure. So when you say that a school is supposed to be not for profit in India, what that basically means is any surplus or profit that your education business might generate, you are supposed to reinvest it back into that business itself. So if I'm running a school and I get like earn 100 rupees from fees and I spend 90 rupees, those 10 rupees surplus, I am supposed to invest it back into the same school. I cannot be using it either as dividend or nobody can pocket that
Yeah.
fee, right? So that is what not for profit means. Now, in terms of returns, again, since you are in a not for profit space, you cannot have a simple sort of return extraction model.
Hmm.
So then, I'm not sure if you want to go into the specific structure of the deals right now, but since the question was why would they
Yeah.
invest in a not for profit space? One, because very little risk. Second, schools are a real estate play, right?
Hmm.
These private equity funds will buy the real estate of schools, at least some of them, and then they will sell it. So there is also the whole appreciation in property thing. That is one way to get returns. And then schools have a lot of scope for offering ancillary services. So where you buy your books from, your
Hmm.
uniforms from, as we will see, the company that I talk about in my article, they actually had a monopoly for this school over all of these services. They would own your vendors who would supply uniforms, stationery, bags, etc. So in that sense, it is like an attractive asset class for an investor.
Thanks, Mitasim. So, the next question for Wali. What does it really look like, in the day to day of how schools function, especially after the PE, funds come into the picture? Because I think you mentioned in the story about how the upgrades are based on how, like, they photograph well and not basically about the quality in education. So, could you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, of course. So, how these firms work, especially GSF ISP, is that they are owned by larger PE firms. So, they are K 12 operators, they run the school. And what these PE firms do is they end up investing in the best schools that already exist in
Hmm.
the country, let's say.
Right.
So these are schools that already have great grades, have great faculty, have great people running them, and founders that know what they're doing, and great brand names. So when they come to the school, they're sort of thinking, okay, how do we take the school to the next level?
Hmm.
Because what already needs to be done in terms of like having great students, having great grades, results is already occurring.
Hmm.
So, in their heads, I think this is a huge point of contention. They believe that taking the school to the next level is through flashy resources. For example, adding pickleball courts or, digitally standardizing all the teachers' grading equipment by giving free tablets across the school. basically things that they can put on the website that they're saying they're doing in addition to what's already happening.
Mm-hmm.
The discourse happens because in the midst of trying to do all these flashy upgrades, they're also trying to cut costs.
Right.
And where they cut costs is where the school is already doing well. Like they'll slash salary hikes for teachers. Sometimes these founders, they'd be running all these tournaments throughout the year, sports tournaments, cultural tournaments, those would be scrapped because they
Mhm.
just wouldn't see the virtue in doing all of those things. As a result, there's a lot of instability, I would say. Like, I think I was talking to one school, I don't remember where it was, where one of the classrooms had 3 different biology teachers in one term because the teachers were just not happy with the way these schools are functioning and they were leaving. So it causes a lot of instability to the learning process itself. So essentially, then you have this empty shell where good teachers and great grades are gone, but you have this really flashy exterior where these new pickleball courts and new auditoriums and new tablets. And the problem is, a lot of these PE firms don't realize that this is an issue right now because you don't see these kind of like problems in the next 3 years. You see them in the next 7, 8 years when you're comparing your results then to what existed 5 years ago. And I think this will only happen when the kids that were already there pre PE graduate because they've had solid foundations so far. And then you had the next generation that's only grown up in PE. So I would say, yeah. Day to day, right now, I don't know if there are any big shifts, but overall, there are huge shifts.
Vali, another question that I had was, about the curriculum. Like, why do they prefer international curriculum like Cambridge?
I think that Cambridge, if I remember correctly, is subject to less. You can correct me if I'm wrong. Less, there's some fee development charges that they're exempt from as compared to CBSE, I think. So they are more likely to be able to charge higher fees for Cambridge legally, as well as even when you're implementing something like an IGCSE curriculum in India, it's a lot less prevalent right now, but the demand for it is growing like super rapidly. So it's a market where there's high demand and you can also charge higher for that.
Uh, Mutasim, about what Wali said, right? About how they're investing more into the flashy exteriors. Can you give us a perspective from the PE funds, like what is driving them to focus on the exterior more than the actual quality of the education?
Okay. So, an important aspect of these investments is the time horizon for which the PE fund is staying in the school. So, like Wali said, they have a time horizon of 3 years, maybe 5 years, right? So they want to optimize for their profits naturally in those 3 to 5 years. So, how do you get profits up, right? For this, we probably have to dive deeper into how they make money. But just to begin with, simply, if you have more students paying more fees, buying more stuff, let's say from these ancillary services, you're earning more money. Okay. So an investor at a PE fund looks at the investment in this one equation. Their profit is revenue minus cost. So you have to get revenues up and cut costs down, right? Now, how do you get revenues up? Uh, so, like Wali was already saying, most of these investments are happening in these international schools, which means they're targeting their target demographic is parents who are not as price sensitive, who are willing to pay, double the amount than you would for an ICSE school just so their child is able to get access to international education. So, in that sense, one thing they can do is just have fee hikes. So in India, the average annual fee hike for private schools is about 9 to 10%. Second, they want more children to come in.
Right.
Now that's where I think this flashy exterior thing comes in. Is when you're advertising the school, how do you sort of capture uh, this demographic of parents who already have the capability of paying high fees, right? Everybody is advertising international boards, everybody is advertising their results. So then you probably move on to these more flashy kinds of things like maybe pickleball courts or other kinds of things, right? So that is basically just a way of increasing their top line so that more students show up. Then again, cutting costs again is simple things that are not immediately visible for parents to make decision whether or not to put their child in school. Those things are not important to them, even though they may be important to your educational outcomes. So I think that naturally works like an incentive, and this is probably not only a school's problem. In general, when Ps are investing even in companies or in hospitals, you see this same sort of incentive structure at play there also.
Right. Thanks, Mutasim. So, Wali, my next question is to you. So, speaking of the Right to Education Act, why do you think private schools were struggling to deliver on the quality of education? Because they have much better access to funding and resources than, say, a public school, right? So, why is there still a gap if all the profit they do make has to be invested in making sure their students get the best education possible?
So the main problem comes down to, I think, the government thinking that a school can run without profit, when in reality, like any private business needs to make profit in order to be able to run. And what this has done for a lot of school owners is it's made things very difficult, because you are making profits. Technically, all these schools are making profits, not like they're not. But they'll have to do this roundabout way about creating these different entities where they can put in that money so it looks like they're not making profits, but they actually are.
Hmm.
There are a lot of bribes that you have to go through in order to be able to do what you want and run these schools. As a result, it has discouraged the number of people coming into private education. So there's less competition.
Right.
And because there's less competition, there's also less incentive for these schools to sort of like fight against each other, improve, because competition is what breeds quality for a lot of industries and breeds innovation. So that's the main reason why there's not many people coming into the education space, into the private education space right now. And in terms of PE investors, if we're talking about them, education in India is still a huge space and it's growing. And there are few schools that are doing really, really well. So if you look at a GSF or an ISP that's come in, they've taken over those 12, 13 schools that are doing very, very well right now.
Hmm.
The problem is because of the RT, Right to Education Act, that says that you can't make profits, a lot of these schools, they don't know when the government is going to come and crack down. One day the government can just show up and be like, I know you're making profits. This is
Right.
how, prove it, shut down the entire space. Or they can randomly come and be like, I'm going to nationalize the school, I'm going to take it under the government. There's a lot of unpredictability. So when PE firms come in, they're like, okay, we have 5 to 10 years max in order to grow the school and sell it. Because there's no way,
Right.
like for example, ISP now is being sold as an entity for I think $7 billion or something.
Wow.
So that's the whole that was literally what Partners Group is what owns ISP. That's what they wanted. They want to
Hmm.
grow and then sell.
Hmm.
And because of this, it puts a lot of pressure on these private schools to squeeze as many profits as they can within that 5 to 10 year horizon, and then they don't care.
Hmm.
A lot of long term investors that would have come in otherwise, if schools were allowed to run for profit, don't come in now
Mhm.
because they're like, okay, anyway, it's so unpredictable, it's so unstable. I'm not going to come in and run this school for the next 20 years. It's not going to make any sense. If schools were allowed to run for profit, these long term patient capital would also be able to come in and help schools that are struggling. So, if you have a school that's not doing so well, ISP is not going to take over that. They want schools that are going to churn out profits really fast in 5 to 10 years.
Right.
But if schools are allowed to run for profit, you would have these long term investors that may come in and be like, okay, this school is struggling. Let me take over the school and help it grow. So I think that if schools are allowed to run for profit, there would be wider berth for long-term patient capital to enter and nurture schools for longer, as opposed to these really fast PE exits that are happening right now.
Right.
Mutasim, in your story, it was very interesting how you actually explained with the example of Elevate Campus, right, which is going public soon, and you actually gave like step by step, like how these organizations make money from schools when they are not functioning as NGOs. Can you take us through those steps?
Right, no problem. So this is where the meat of the story was actually. So imagine that you are running a school. School is supposed to be registered as a not-for-profit, and school. So you look at school into two parts. One is the real estate of the school, the land, the buildings, the playground. The second part is the whole operations sort of capability of the school, right? Which is teachers, staff, teams that set the curriculum, principal, whatever.
Hmm.
So the way these deals are structured is you look at these as two separate things. So you have the real estate, the property of the school, which is held under what's called a property company or a propco. Then you have the rest of the school, the operations, which is held under a opco,
Hmm.
right? Now, a private company can have the license for this opco, which is what was happening here. But so what the PE school will do is it will go to the opco, which in many cases may already be owning the real estate, or they're buying it from some other institutional investor. They'll ask the school to sell them the real estate, right?
Hmm.
So the PE firm first buys the real estate and it becomes the landlord. The tenant is the opco. What the PE fund does next is they also buy a majority stake in the tenant company or the opco,
Wow.
right? So now you own, let's say, 51% of the opco, you own 100% of the real estate. And so there's a landlord and there's a tenant, but these are both sort of under the same, owned by the same entity, which is what
Yeah.
was the case within Elevate
Yeah, it seems
campuses.
like the whole thing is rigged
The whole
almost.
thing is
Yeah.
seems like it is rigged.
Yeah.
And so the regulation around this is also, I think, a little complicated. This is basically a related party transaction. If you're buying and selling a product between two entities, both of whom are owned by the same eventual entity, the only way you can do it legally is to do it at market prices, right? And if you look at sort of my investigation, the rent for this school that I was talking about was nearly double the rent
Yes.
for not just other schools, for Google, for how much Google and Microsoft were paying in Hyderabad, right? So what effectively ends up happening is that the tenant and the landlord are sort of controlled by the same person. So it's a rigged negotiation, right? And so the private equity fund can ask for as much in rent as it wants technically, which is how they are bypassing the not-for-profit legislation, right? Because what is the not-for-profit legislation? That whatever your profits are have to be reinvested back. Now, the private equity fund can inflate the expenses so much that you have nearly no profits left, right? So
Right.
they'll keep increasing the rent till the profits that you.
Yeah, how much was the percentage that they were actually spending on just on the rent in this case?
It was 83% of their surplus.
That was insane.
That is insane.
Yeah.
And that was a conservative estimate. I know for a fact that it's higher than that, but based on the whatever public numbers we had available, it came out to about 83%. So, but this is just one sort of way of structuring deals around education. You might have other ways, but I think there are other large PE funds that use this same. It's called a prop co-opco structure. They use the same structure to extract rent, and this is a common play in real estate, right? So, for example, you also have this kind of play in offices, so workspaces. For example, something like WeWork,
Right.
right? It might be the case that the private equity fund is owning the building, office building, and then WeWork, the operator of that building, same private equity fund also has a stake in WeWork. So then they are able to siphon off
Understood.
money pretty elegantly. So
Yeah.
that is basically.
So, Wally, now going back to the other side again, you were talking about what it was like for these private schools before PE funds came into the picture, right? When they were still founder and promoter led. Can you paint us a picture of, uh, how things have switched?
So I think this comes back to a broader cultural thing in India where people in India trust other people. If someone gives you a recommendation, you're more likely to take it more seriously. Even in terms of jobs, right? If someone has referred you, you have an advantage of a candidate who hasn't been referred. And the same thing happens in schools. The school's figurehead or founder is kind of like the face of the organization. So a lot of parents don't trust institutions as much as they trust the founder.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you look at Hyderabad, there's a school called Glendale, and it was run by this pretty much this power couple for like the longest time. And while they were there, a lot of the cream of the crop, let's say, of Hyderabad used to attend the school because they used to have a lot of faith in this couple that they would run the organization well. And as a result, the school benefited from having that top layer of kids that would come. The who's who and whatever would come to the school. When they left and when GSF took over, it kind of became like the face of the school is gone. And the reason why so many parents put their kids in that school is gone. So as a result, top kids left and went somewhere else. And combined with the depreciating quality, the type of students and the quality of the classroom itself changes, I would say, in terms of the students. Then if you look at teachers, when you have a founder, right, the founder is deeply invested in their vision for the school. They envision running the school forever. They're more likely to take care of their teacher as well. Like, for example, the founder of GSF, her name's Anjum. She used to know each and every teacher personally by name, and she used to counsel them on their personal problems. She used to organize all these sessions where she used to, be like, this is how you're supposed to teach in the classroom. These are different skills you can learn as a teacher. So I think even the teachers, in terms of the training they get and the kind of love they get, is a lot more. And I've spoken to teachers also about this, a lot more in founder-led schools. As opposed to when you have a private equity come in, they don't particularly care about their teachers. So they treat them more like employees than they do anything else. So it's a much more rigid system, I think, now than it was before. And education is a very people centric business. You can't be so rigid with your rules. You can't treat your teachers as employees and nothing else. So I think losing that brand and losing that figurehead is as detrimental for the school as losing the quality. I think it's all interlinked.
Yeah. But you also gave the example of this school called Chirek International School, where which saw PE come in,
Hmm.
but things are going pretty well still. How is that happening?
So, from what I understand, I've spoken to a couple of students there. Chirac itself didn't talk to me personally because they don't contact the media. But from what I understand, they consulted and really understood the school and the founder's vision for the school and the landscape of the education system before taking over. So they really came into it with the mindset of, okay, fine, this is how India works as a place. These are the kind of salary spikes we need to expect. These are the kind of things we need to do if we want to keep our teachers. So I think fundamentally they had a better understanding of how to run a school in India as opposed to being a very rigid business. So when they came in, they continued the founder's vision, they didn't erode it.
Okay, I have a question for Mutasim. So, we understand that the whole reason why PE funds are coming into this sector is ultimately to make money, right? And also, they have a short span of time to do it. Um, but is there any way that you see where they can be kind of incentivized to focus more on the quality of education?
So, in order to answer this, let me try to think through the larger context of the education landscape in the country. So, you see, and you will find a lot of this data in Elevate's DRHP, which is interesting. Their whole thesis starts by looking at how large the gap in infrastructure is between public and private education. And their thesis continues to say that this gap is going to grow even more, right? So their investment thesis is premised on the fact that public education in India is not going to get better. Whatever reason, not enough capital, the
Fair
government
enough.
infra
Yeah.
not working
Yeah.
well. And then they go on to say that, education affects your employment outcomes. What that means on sort of on a broader structural level is that in an economy which is already so unequal in terms of how resources are distributed, you'll have the economically disadvantaged who are not able to afford private schools. That means they're going to have children who go to these public schools, which is going to inevitably impact their employment outcomes, right? For example, if I've studied at an ICSE school and I'm preparing for JEE, I presumably have a lot more context than somebody who's not
Mm-hmm.
in general.
Mm-hmm.
So now you see what's happening. One, the gap between public and private is growing, and this private capital only wants to sort of enter the private school space, because
Yeah.
why would they want to enter the government
Yeah.
school space, right?
Mm.
So whatever we are talking about, I think it's important to caveat it by saying we are talking about a very small percentage of schools which is attended by people with a lot of privilege,
Mm.
in that sense, right? So whether or so if the government were to come and say that, okay, we're not going to have schools as completely not for profit, we're going to cap that you're going to be making these many profits, maybe for this top cream of schools which private equity is targeting, maybe you could have some sort of incentive structure worked out there where it's not completely not for profit and you cannot make as many profits as you want.
Mm.
So maybe there is an equilibrium there. But I think the larger landscape is sort of much more complicated than that, because then you also have to consider the fact that, let's say, if you granted schools before profit, what about the millions of schools that are not these IB, IGCSE
Yeah.
schools that are run
Exactly.
by builders and like politicians and
Yeah.
whatnot, and these like local power pockets?
Mm-hmm.
What is going to happen with these schools? So I think when we are having this conversation, it's important to include the 90% and not only talk
Absolutely.
about the
Yeah.
top 10%. So I am not, I don't see a reform solution to this problem. I think it's just a structural thing, and I don't know whether you can have any incentives that can fix this long term.
Okay, so now we're kind of running out of time and we have one last question. So, Mutasam mentioned how we've missed out on speaking about the 90% when we're talking about education. So, Vali, in a newsletter you wrote recently on education, you mentioned a voucher system. Now, I was wondering if that is a possible solution to this issue that will come up eventually, right? Where PE entering education will obviously make it more inaccessible to the larger majority of students. So, yeah, what do you think?
By possible, will the government let it happen? Still very much up in the air, probably unlikely. But in terms of a system that can be implemented, I think it would solve the issue. I think of a lot of these kids not having access to the schools because they can't afford it. So instead of solely subsidizing public schools and putting so much money into them and paying teachers obscene amounts and they don't even show up to class most of the time, why don't we invest some of that money into giving vouchers to these poor families? So maybe 50,000 a year or 70,000 a year that they can use in order to afford a private school of their choice, for
Right.
example. That way, even the child has access to better quality education because that kid would have gone to a public school, right? Because they couldn't have afforded a private school. But now they could have the opportunity to go to a private school. So, in this very hypothetical, like perfect world where this comes into play, I think this is a solution. And it is a solution that's being proposed by members of this high committee that has been created right now. Whether it'll come to play is probably unlikely, but could be very beneficial if it does.
Thank you so much, guys, for joining us and giving us your time and for also writing these very insightful and telling stories.